Inside a live studio in Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett goes head-to-head with Fox News host Laura Ingraham in a brutal showdown over race, power, and justice in America. Laura tries to corner her with sarcasm, edited footage, and the label "Race Card Queen" in front of 14 million viewers. But within minutes, Jasmine turns the ambush on its head, dropping hard evidence that exposes the setup, stops the room cold, and shifts the balance of power in real time. What happens when the woman they tried to silence becomes the one holding the mic? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The countdown clock hit 0. Red lights blinked to life as the theme music faded and the room held its breath. The Nation Speaks was now live, broadcast coast to coast into living rooms, airports, and war rooms alike. Laura Ingraham sat poised at her desk like a queen at tribunal, papers neatly stacked but never needed. Her true weapon was her tongue. Her voice sliced through the silence. Tonight we confront the narrative gripping America. Racial injustice, real or manufactured. The words hung like a loaded gun in the air. The crowd didn't clap. They waited, eyes forward, anticipation thick as steel wire. Then came the entrance. Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the set not like a guest, but like a storm held together in human form. Black suit sharp as a verdict, expression unreadable, she walked with the quiet command of someone who had swallowed courtrooms, dismantled prosecutors, and buried bad faith arguments without raising her voice. She took her seat across from Laura, legs crossed, posture tall. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. The tension between them wasn't new. It was institutional. It was centuries old. Laura offered a smile tight enough to cut glass. "Welcome, Congresswoman. Thank you for agreeing to this honest conversation," Jasmine replied without blinking. "Thank you. Let's make it one." Beneath the civility, the message was clear. This wasn't dialogue. This was battle dressed in studio lighting, and both women had come armed. The tension didn't dissolve. It recalibrated, like the stillness right before a sniper exhales. Laura adjusted her posture, her face a mask of intellectual curiosity. But her eyes told a different story. Cold, calculating, and waiting for the first crack to appear. "Let's begin with something simple," she said. Her tone dipped in honey but structured like a trap. "We've heard a lot about systemic racism, about police bias. But here's a thought. What if in many of these tragic cases, the real issue isn't skin color, but behavior?" She let the words hang, carefully. Not too sharp, not too blunt, just plausible enough to sound fair to anyone who had never tasted fear during a traffic stop. Jasmine felt her heartbeat slow, not from calm, but from control. Controlled rage, controlled memory. She had heard this before, not from academics, not from leaders, but from juries that called fear a defense and skin a weapon. From men who pulled triggers faster when the suspect didn't look like their sons. From networks that showed mugshots instead of graduation photos. Her hands remained still on the table, but her spine straightened, her breath deepened. She knew what Laura was doing. This wasn't curiosity, it was code. A sanitized accusation masquerading as dialogue. The implication was brutal in its simplicity. If they hadn't moved wrong, they wouldn't be dead. That wasn't a question. It was a verdict, and it was already written. And now they expected her to debate it, like humanity was a matter of perspective. She didn't blink. Not because she wasn't stunned, because she had been here before. Dozens of times. Hundreds, maybe. In law school lecture halls where her lived experience was treated as a hypothetical. In courtrooms where her client's pain was reduced to paperwork. On Capitol Hill, where her voice had been drowned out by polished men who only respected numbers, not the people behind them. So she gave them numbers. Jasmine sat forward, her tone low and deliberate like a heartbeat under pressure. "If you're going to ask whether this is about race or behavior, then let's begin where truth lives. Statistics." She paused only a moment, letting the shift settle in the air, the shift from being cornered to reclaiming command. "Black Americans make up 13% of this country's population," she began, her voice steady. And yet they account for nearly 28% of those fatally shot by police. And before anyone says more crime equals more force, let's go deeper. Laura leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, not because she was surprised, but because the tempo had changed, and she could feel it. Jasmine wasn't playing defense. She was building a case. Black drivers, Jasmine continued, are almost twice as likely to be pulled over by police compared to white drivers, and significantly less likely to be told why they were stopped. And when pulled over, were more likely to be searched. But here's the twist. Those searches, they're less likely to yield contraband than searches of white drivers. A ripple moved through the audience, subtle but undeniable, like oxygen catching fire in a sealed room. Jasmine didn't break stride. She never raised her voice, but every word struck like it had weight. Black children make up 15% of public school students, yet represent 31% of those referred to law enforcement. The school-to-prison pipeline isn't a theory, it's an infrastructure. The numbers weren't just statistics, they were memories, faces, clients, mothers she had held in courthouse hallways, shaking. Fathers whose eyes never left the floor because shame had become more familiar than justice. She had carried them with her into every hearing, every policy fight, every studio like this one. And now they were here too, invisible, but no less present. She looked directly at Laura, her tone sharpening like the edge of a blade not swung in anger, but in necessity. You asked if the problem is behavior, not race. Let me be clear. The behavior in question, more often than not, is existing while black. Walking home, sitting in a car, playing in a park, sleeping in your own bed. Another pause. This one colder. And before you tell me that's anecdotal, Jasmine said, I invite you to read the Justice Department's own findings, where entire departments have been shown to disproportionately target black communities, not by accident, but by policy. Ferguson, Louisville, Chicago. Her gaze didn't waver. If this were about individual behavior, the punishment would be consistent. But it's not. It's selective, predictable, patterned. And patterns don't lie. People do. The audience was no longer merely watching. They were inside the moment. Some nodded slowly, others sat stiffly, arms crossed like shields against the discomfort crawling into their bones. Truth can be loud, but it's often most dangerous when it's quiet, when it stares at you without blinking. Jasmine leaned back finally, her delivery complete. Not dramatic, not desperate, just devastating. You want to talk about personal responsibility? Fine. But let's start with the institutions that have never been held responsible for how they police, prosecute, or punish Black Americans at a disproportionate rate. She let silence have the final word. It echoed louder than applause ever could. The air had just begun to settle, heavy with the weight of Jasmine's words, when Laura struck like a recoiling serpent. There was no build-up, no hesitation, just the unmistakable sound of someone who had waited long enough and could no longer let the narrative slip from her grasp. Her voice, usually polished and performative, now cracked with something sharper. Condescension lined with contempt. There she goes again, Laura said, interrupting with a half-laugh that wasn't meant to disarm. It was meant to diminish. Always the same song, always the same card. You can dress it up in data, you can paint it in poetry, but let's call it what it is. She leaned forward, her mouth curling into a theatrical sneer, and delivered the blow with deliberate force. You're not a congresswoman anymore, Jasmine. You're the race card queen of Capitol Hill. Time didn't slow. It fractured. The words hit the room like a courtroom door slammed mid-sentence. Not a gasp, not a murmur, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't invite interpretation. The kind that commands stillness because everyone knows instinctively that something irreversible has just been said. Cameras stood frozen in place. The operators behind them didn't dare blink, afraid that even movement might shatter the moment's gravity. The lighting above flickered slightly, not from power, but from tension, like the studio itself understood what had just occurred. The co-host, sitting beside Laura, instinctively shifted in his seat. His lips parted as if to say something. A joke, a redirect, anything to break the sudden frost in the air. But no words came. His hands fidgeted with a pen that now seemed wildly out of place, as if writing could salvage what cruelty had just undone. Behind him, in the wings, a production assistant lowered her headset. The paper in her hand trembled, the words on the page meaningless now. Everyone, everywhere on that set was no longer working. They were watching. Jasmine sat motionless, her expression unreadable, carved in marble. But her stillness wasn't weakness. It was compression, controlled pressure, a dam holding back generations of insult, of erasure, of being told that her experiences, her pain, and even her identity were up for debate. The insult had been meant to provoke her into fury, but fury was easy. Fury was expected, and Jasmine had not survived this long by giving people what they expected. Her silence did more than speak. It accused. Because in that instant, the room wasn't just a studio. It became a microcosm of America's most uncomfortable truth. That a black woman, armed with reason, facts, and a voice trained in justice, could still be reduced to a stereotype with 6 careless words. Race card queen. It wasn't clever. It wasn't accidental. It was a calculated act of rhetorical violence, a public lynching, not of her body, but of her credibility. And it was done with a smile. Laura sat back, satisfied, unaware that the line she thought was a kill shot had instead revealed everything. Her confidence, her timing, her performance, it all rang hollow now. She had drawn blood, yes, but not from Jasmine. The wound was to herself, to the idea that civility was ever her goal, to the illusion that her questions were neutral. The studio wasn't breathing. The audience didn't dare move. It was as if everyone in that space had been made accomplice to something they didn't see coming and now didn't know how to undo. The insult had landed like a bullet coated in silk, sharp, fatal, and dressed in performance. But Jasmine didn't move. Not a flicker, not a breath. On camera, it looked like strength. Inside, it was something older and heavier, a stillness carved from centuries of restraint. She sat perfectly upright, her posture so composed it almost seemed unnatural, like someone who had learned long ago that dignity when under attack must become armor. She didn't speak, not yet. Instead, she inhaled, slow, controlled. A breath not meant to calm, but to reach back, to tap into the deep, bitter well where memory wasn't nostalgic. It was weaponized. She let the room fall away. The lights, the cameras, Laura's smug expression, gone. All replaced by an echo, a voice from long ago, a familiar sting beneath the skin. She was 15, standing alone at the front of her high school debate class in Dallas, a copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X tucked under one arm, her notes trembling slightly in her hands. She had just finished dismantling the argument that America is now colorblind, citing redlining maps, unequal school funding, and the stark difference in police stops in South Dallas compared to the suburbs. Her voice hadn't cracked, but the room had. Her classmates were silent. Some sneered. The teacher smiled but didn't applaud. And then a white boy in the back, football jacket half zipped, a grin just shy of cruelty, called out, "There she goes again with the race card." Laughter followed. The teacher didn't correct him. Jasmine remembered standing there, heat flooding her chest, her throat tightening not from shame, but from the sharp, early knowledge that truth didn't matter if the room was trained to mock it. Years later, it happened again. She was 26, freshly barred and barely sleeping, fighting her third court-appointed case in a week. Her client was a soft-spoken 19-year-old wrongly arrested for burglary. Wrong time, wrong place, wrong skin. Jasmine had stayed up 2 nights straight gathering surveillance tapes, calling witnesses, mapping out the blocks from memory. Her closing argument was electric, dispassionate facts wrapped in relentless logic. When the verdict came, not guilty, her client's mother wept against her shoulder. But the assistant DA approached her outside the courthouse, eyes narrowed, mouth twisted in a condescending smirk. "You've got fire," he said. "Just don't build your whole career on the race card. It gets old." Then he walked off, briefcase swinging like a gavel. Jasmine had stood on the steps of the courthouse for a long time that day. Long enough for the sun to slide behind the skyline. Long enough to understand that in the eyes of some, Defending Black lives would always be framed as manipulation, not advocacy. That memory never left her. Neither did the next one. Capitol Hill, 2 years ago, she'd just given a speech on racial disparities in sentencing laws, backed by DOJ reports, court data, and lived reality. She left the podium to an uneasy hush, not because her speech lacked evidence, but because it had made comfort impossible. In the elevator, a senior colleague leaned in, lowered his voice and muttered, "You're smart, Jasmine. Just be careful not to become that kind of Democrat. The kind who made white donors nervous. The kind who made everything about race." She had smiled politely then. She didn't feel polite now. The studio returned like a curtain lifting, lights humming above. Laura still seated, triumphant, unaware that the silence she had just created was no longer working in her favor. The co-host was pale, shifting in his chair. The studio audience was frozen, eyes fixed on Jasmine, waiting for fury, for collapse, for words. But Jasmine gave them none of that, not at first. When she finally spoke, it was like steel being unsheathed in a room that had mistaken her for unarmed. "That title isn't new, Laura," she said, her voice low and clean. Each word landed with the weight of something sharpened by years of erosion. "I've heard it since I was 15. She didn't blink. From boys in the back of class who couldn't spell oppression but knew how to laugh at it. From prosecutors who thought winning made me uppity. From lawmakers who smiled in public and dismissed me behind closed doors. Her gaze locked on Laura, unshaken. "But I never thought I'd hear it from someone with a national platform. Someone with makeup, microphones, and absolutely no shame." She paused, not to gather herself, but to let the words settle. Let them sting. "You call it a card like it's a trick, but what I speak about, what I live through, is not a tactic. It's reality, documented, measured, buried in reports no one reads until someone dies on camera." Another pause. "I don't pull race," she said slowly. "I carry it every day, in every room, in every courtroom where my client is presumed guilty before opening his mouth, in every committee where my voice gets drowned under layers of civility, and now, apparently, even in studios like this, where truth is treated like noise." She leaned back slightly, but her tone never softened. "If telling that truth makes me the race card queen, then so be it. I'd rather wear that crown than sit quietly while people like you pretend the house isn't still on fire." The final sentence didn't echo. It settled, like smoke, and no one in that studio, on camera or off, could breathe quite the same way again. The room had barely begun to recover from the tension Jasmine's words had carved into the air, when Laura leaned forward with a calculated ease, her smile returning. Not the kind that reflected warmth, but the practiced kind a litigator wears when the jury starts to slip. She adjusted the stack of cue cards beside her, more for effect than necessity, then crossed one leg over the other, radiating poise as she readied her next strike. But this time, it wouldn't come in the form of open insult. It would be subtler, more surgical, because Laura wasn't just playing for dominance now. She was playing for optics. "You know," she began, with that syrupy drawl she reserved for moments she wanted to sound harmless. "I've been watching your interviews, listening to your speeches, and Jasmine, you're very good. You've got a gift." She tilted her head just slightly, smile widening. "But here's the thing. You make everything about race. If a police officer sneezes too hard in the wrong direction, you say it's racism." The words landed with an oily slickness, meant to sound humorous. But there was no laughter, just the low vibration of discomfort passing through the room like static. Laura wasn't rattled. She didn't need approval. She needed distraction, a pivot, an emotional misfire that would tilt Jasmine off balance and recast her as what Laura had been trying to sell all along. Not a truth teller, but a dramatist. A woman who wielded race not as reality, but as theater. Laura leaned back in her chair and gave a cue to the control booth, snapping her fingers without looking. "Roll the clip," she said with all the casual menace of someone ordering a hit in broad daylight. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the massive screen behind them came to life. The sound clicked on with surgical timing, and suddenly Jasmine's voice filled the studio, but not as herself, as a fragment, a caricature. The footage was from a judiciary hearing 2 years prior. Jasmine had been questioning a district attorney involved in a highly publicized arrest of 3 black teenagers. In the original hearing, she had methodically laid out disparities in charging decisions, cited internal documents, and pointed to systemic flaws in pretrial detention policies. But that's not what this clip showed. This clip was cropped at the top and bottom, stripped of timestamps and committee watermarks. It began midway through a sentence, with Jasmine's voice sharp, intense. "So you're telling me you can't see the racial bias?" Then it jumped, cutting to another line from minutes later. "This is what happens when white prosecutors think they're untouchable." Then another jump, her voice raised, frustration visible. "This is what black mothers are terrified of." The edits were clean, the jumps seamless. To the uninformed eye, it looked like a meltdown, a soundbite stitched together to look like fury without context, a rant. Laura turned to face the audience, her voice dropping into a performance of disappointment. "There it is," she said, as if unveiling proof in a court case. "Accusations of racism before the arrest report was even read. This is what we've come to. We don't need trials anymore. Just outrage and a camera." She looked back at Jasmine with a sigh, equal parts theatrical and smug. "Is that justice, Congresswoman? Or just very good television?" The audience was still quiet, but not passive. They were processing. A few exchanged uncertain glances. A man in the third row rubbed his temples. A woman near the back folded her arms, squinting at the screen as if trying to stitch the footage back into its original form in her mind. They weren't sure what they had seen, but Laura knew that uncertainty was enough. She wasn't trying to prove Jasmine was dishonest. She only needed to suggest the possibility. She leaned forward again, pressing the advantage. "This is what you do," Laura said, her voice gaining volume, sharpening into something colder. "You inflate, you exaggerate. You take a spark of tension and pour gasoline on it until the whole nation's on fire. You don't debate, you accuse. You don't analyze, you dramatize. And the moment anyone disagrees with you," she raised her hands mockingly, "racism, always racism, always the race card." The words felt rehearsed because they were. She had built this strategy from the ground up, knowing that facts could be buried under spectacle. That evidence could be drowned out by a well-timed video and a smug line of sarcasm. She wasn't just challenging Jasmine's ideas. She was attacking her credibility, brick by brick. She was constructing a version of Jasmine the country would distrust. Too emotional, too aggressive, too ready to cry foul. But it wasn't just a tactic. It was a trap, one carefully laid. One Jasmine had seen before. The injustice wasn't just in the manipulation, it was in the ease with which it was delivered. Laura didn't flinch when she used doctored clips to discredit real suffering. She didn't blink as she painted a sitting congresswoman, a civil rights lawyer, as little more than a reactive figure screaming racism for applause. She weaponized Jasmine's passion, twisted it into noise, and dared her to react, to snap, to interrupt, to fit the mold she'd just drawn. Jasmine didn't move. She'd seen this game before, on courtroom steps, in Senate chambers, in city council meetings where white men with thin smiles spoke in codes and performed respect while erasing everything she stood for. The pressure now wasn't about defending truth. It was about surviving the performance of the lie. And Jasmine was not about to give them the show they wanted. Not yet. She stood still in the eye of the storm, watching as the room settled into an uneasy quiet after Laura's final volley. But Jasmine knew better than to respond with fire. Not yet. That's what they wanted. Rage could be edited. Emotion could be twisted. No, this wasn't the moment for anger. This was the moment for exposure. And she was holding the match. Without breaking eye contact, she reached for the small black remote resting beside her legal file. Unassuming, ordinary, but the way she lifted it, with deliberate slowness, transformed it into a scalpel. "You've played your clip, Laura," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Now let me show you what real evidence looks like." The screen behind them came to life. The studio darkened, not for drama, but out of necessity, the room itself adjusting to the weight of what was coming. It began with dash cam footage, shaky, raw, unedited. The timestamp revealed it was from 3 months ago. A dimly lit suburban street. 2 patrol cars parked diagonally, their floodlights casting harsh beams across the windshield of a silver sedan. A man stood outside the car. Black, mid-30s, collared shirt, slacks, unarmed. His hands were raised but not flailing. Just raised, palms up, steady. A child, maybe 8 years old, sat in the back seat, visible only by the dim interior light. The father was speaking calmly. "My son is in the car," he said. "He's scared. Please, I'm complying." Then came the voices, 2 officers shouting conflicting commands. "Step back. Don't move. Hands on your head." The man tried to follow both at once, an impossible task, and within seconds they rushed him. One grabbed his wrist, the other forced him down onto the hood. The child began screaming, a single long wail that didn't stop. And as they handcuffed the man, face pressed to the metal, his voice rose above it all. "I don't want my son growing up in this country." Jasmine let the video run a second longer than most networks would dare. Long enough for the viewer to hear the officer say, "Wrong guy," and walk away like it meant nothing. The screen faded to black, and the room broke open, not with noise, but with silence so suffocating it felt like an indictment. Jasmine didn't speak immediately. She allowed the moment to sit in the chest of every person present. She wanted them to feel what it meant when the truth wasn't cleaned up for cameras, when it wasn't cut for time, when it wasn't filtered through a headline or buried in a footnote. Then she moved, one step forward, then another. She took the folder from the table. It was thick, bound with a red ribbon. She broke the seal herself. "This," she said, holding it aloft, "is an internal report from the Department of Justice. Not public, not yet, but I'm making it public now, because some truths can't wait for bureaucracy to grow a conscience." She placed it gently on the table, spine up so the gold DOJ emblem gleamed under the studio lights. "It covers 10 jurisdictions over a 5-year period," she continued, her voice rising just slightly, not with heat but with gravity. "In every single one, Black defendants were more likely to be arrested, more likely to be charged, and more likely to receive harsher sentences than white defendants who committed the exact same crimes. That's not opinion, that's federal data." She flipped open the first page. Here in Jefferson County, for example, Black individuals made up 14% of the population, but 58% of all felony prosecutions. In Broward, prosecutors were 3 times more likely to seek mandatory minimums if the defendant was Black. In Chicago, body cam footage malfunctioned in 47% of stops involving Black civilians, but only 12% involving white civilians. She let the words land like hammers. This isn't about feelings. This isn't about victimhood. This is about design. A system designed to fail some of us more often, more violently, and more permanently than others. She turned back toward Laura then, not with a smirk, not with rage, but with clarity so precise it cut through the illusion like a razor. "You call me the race card queen," she said, repeating the slur with a slow, deliberate cadence. "You think it's clever, that it reduces me, that it makes the pain I speak about small enough for your audience to dismiss." She stepped forward again. Her voice was steady, but now it carried weight, volume, intent. "But here's the truth, Laura. If speaking about what's documented, recorded, and devastatingly real makes me that, then long live the crown." She held her ground in the center of the set, her presence now larger than the frame. "Because silence," she said, turning her gaze directly into the camera, "is what keeps injustice alive. It's what lets that father get shoved to the ground. It's what lets prosecutors sleep soundly after destroying lives. It's what turns trauma into noise and people into problems." She paused, and in that pause, the audience didn't move. She placed the DOJ folder down next to Laura's notes, neatly, as if offering the truth as evidence in the court of public conscience. Then she stepped back, her hands still. She had said her piece, not as a rebuttal, as a reckoning, and there was no sarcasm, no clip, no spin machine in the world that could edit that out. The silence that followed wasn't the same as the one before. This one wasn't loaded with tension. It was full of reckoning. It wasn't the pause before a counterattack. It was the silence people fall into when they realize they've just witnessed something true, something raw, something they can't explain away. It was the hush that follows a verdict or a funeral, a stillness so total it didn't feel like a break in the broadcast. It felt like the room itself was praying. And then it came, small at first, the sound of two hands clapping, software tentative, but unmistakable. A second pair followed, then a third. And just like that, scattered applause began to ripple through the studio like the first drops of rain before a storm. Not thunderous, not performative, just real. It wasn't the applause of entertainment. It was the applause of recognition, of people who had come expecting a debate and instead found themselves facing something too human to argue with. Near the third row, a woman in her early 50s, a schoolteacher from Virginia who had brought her niece to the taping, slowly lowered her hands from her lap and began to clap, her eyes still fixed on the blank screen where the footage had been moments ago. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just clapped, tears caught in the corners of her lashes, breathing through a throat she hadn't realized had tightened until just now. A man on the far right, dressed in a gray suit with a veteran's lapel pin, didn't clap. But he sat back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and closed his eyes for a beat longer than a blink. His jaw, which had been clenched for most of the segment, finally released. In the front row, a young black boy, maybe 11, reached for his mother's hand and whispered something. She squeezed his fingers, her other hand swiping away a tear that trailed silently down her cheek. And in the very back, a woman in a navy pantsuit, the executive producer of the program, stood behind the control booth, watching everything. She didn't give any direction, didn't signal for a break. She just stared, lips slightly parted, as if Jasmine's words had reached past her headset and straight into something no rating system could measure. Still, no one interrupted. No technician spoke in Jasmine's earpiece. No floor manager gestured for her to wrap up. No producer whispered into Laura's IFB. Because in that moment, everyone in that room, crew, staff, audience, even Laura, understood a singular truth. The story had changed hands. Jasmine hadn't just delivered a speech. She had rewritten the script. And now the studio didn't belong to the network. It belonged to her. She stood still, not to prolong the applause, but to honor it, because she knew that kind of silence-turned recognition didn't come often and never came easily. She didn't look smug. She didn't preen. She didn't bask. She just stood in it like someone who had survived a war with her integrity intact and her voice sharper than ever. When she finally moved, it was only to place the DOJ report back onto the table. She did it carefully, precisely, like an artifact that belonged in a museum or a courtroom. Her fingers lingered on the folder for a moment longer than necessary, not for drama, but to signal that the evidence didn't vanish when the cameras did. In the wings, one of the junior producers wiped his glasses twice, first because they had fogged up, and second because his vision had blurred. He wasn't sure when he started crying, only that he had, not loudly, just quietly, as if his body had decided for him that what he'd seen was no longer a segment, it was a reckoning. Laura Ingraham remained seated, frozen. Her smile, once a polished weapon, had collapsed into something else entirely. Not shame, not yet, but unease. The ground beneath her had shifted, and for the first time all night, she couldn't find her footing. Her hands, which usually gestured confidently while she spoke, now rested awkwardly on her cue cards, as if they no longer belonged to her. The power dynamic she had curated with surgical precision, through edits, interruption, and insult, had been shattered by something she hadn't anticipated, truth that refused to be tamed. And Jasmine, she didn't look at Laura. She didn't have to. The applause grew again, not in volume, but in certainty. Some people clapped, others nodded, a few whispered to one another, but no one, absolutely no one, dared speak over her. Because in that studio, time had become elastic. Authority had changed faces, and every single person knew they were no longer watching two sides argue. They were watching one woman reclaim a legacy that had been mislabeled, repackaged, and mocked for too long. Jasmine breathed in, once, slowly. Not out of exhaustion, but to ground herself, to take in the air she had just cleared, to hold space for the people she spoke for who couldn't be in the room, the ones in holding cells, the ones in graves, the ones who never got to finish their sentences, literal or otherwise. She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. The room said it for her. In that moment, she wasn't just Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She was something else entirely. Undeniable, unshaken, uninterrupted. But the silence couldn't last forever. And Laura, cornered by it, knew she had seconds before the narrative slipped too far from her grip to recover. Her fingers twitched slightly as she straightened the edge of her note cards, not because she needed them, but because her composure was cracking. She had watched the room shift, had felt the authority drain from her voice like power from a dying mic. Jasmine hadn't just answered. She had seized the stage, the air, the story. And Laura Ingraham was not built to lose control in her own studio. She leaned forward, voice syrupy but strained, her smile no longer convincing, just mechanical. "You know what your problem is, Jasmine," she said, tilting her head slightly like a disappointed teacher correcting a loud student. "You're not helping your people. You're dividing the country." The line was meant to sound noble, self-righteous, an appeal to unity wrapped around an accusation. "Every time you speak, it's us versus them. You don't inspire, you incite." The room tensed again, not because the insult had landed, but because it hadn't. It was off-key, poorly timed, and reeked of desperation. Laura wasn't wielding power now. She was swinging wildly in the dark, hoping to bruise something, anything. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Because after all that had been said, after the father's voice, after the DOJ files, after the audience reclaimed their own silence, this wasn't a counter-argument. It was a gasp for relevance, and the more Laura spoke, the smaller she sounded. Then it happened. A new sound, from backstage, not planned, not scripted. A sudden voice piped in through the studio monitor by accident or sabotage. A voice that wasn't meant for the audience, but leaked through the intercom anyway. The crew froze. Jasmine turned her head. The producer cursed under her breath, but the audio kept playing, and every word burned like acid on truth. It was Laura. But not this Laura, the poised host in a designer blazer with her hair sculpted for the camera. This was the Laura from 10 minutes before the broadcast began, behind closed doors, speaking to her production team in a tone far colder than the one she wore on stage. "She'll bring the heat. Just let her talk. We'll pin her as the race lady. Ratings will skyrocket." The studio didn't move. The feed wasn't high quality, but it didn't need to be. The voice was unmistakable. The smug inflection. The strategy laced in spectacle. The language of someone who didn't see Jasmine as a guest, or even as a person, but as content. A few gasps broke through the audience like glass cracking under pressure. Someone whispered, "Did she just say that?" Another muttered, "What the hell?" The co-host on set glanced at the crew with a panicked look, mouthing, "Cut the feed." But it was too late. The leak had done more than expose Laura's private thoughts. It had obliterated her public mask. Laura's face went pale, the kind of pale that no makeup artist can cover. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. Her hands were frozen mid-gesture, like a marionette whose strings had suddenly been cut. The moment was longer than any silence before it. Longer than any monologue. Because this silence wasn't Jasmine's doing, it was Laura's unraveling. Every pair of eyes turned toward her now, not in admiration, not in sympathy, but in revelation. The crowd had watched her play the patriot, the truth teller, the neutral moderator, and now they had heard what she really was, an architect of division playing queen in a house of mirrors. Jasmine remained standing, unmoved. She hadn't orchestrated the leak. She didn't need to. The truth had a habit of finding its own stage when the lies got too loud. She looked at Laura, not with glee, not with triumph, but with something deeper. The stillness of someone who had seen this exact moment coming. The look of a woman who had sat through too many panels, too many debates, too many civil conversations where her humanity was used as ratings fuel. And now finally, the curtain had dropped. Not on her, but on the woman who had tried to silence her with a smile and a slogan. The room held its breath again, but this time not for Jasmine. This silence was for Laura, and she had nothing left to say. The silence hadn't yet settled when the avalanche began. The leaked audio was only seconds old, but the fallout moved faster than any satellite delay. And even before the director could kill the broadcast, phones were already buzzing, beneath desks, inside coat pockets, in the control room, in the front row of the audience. Journalists in the studio, those invited to observe, not participate, were now fully awake, tapping frantically on tablets and devices. What had just happened wasn't just news. It was scandal in real time. The moment where facade collapsed into confession. Then came the first voice, clear and defiant. It wasn't from the audience. It wasn't even from Jasmine. It came from one of the network's own, a political correspondent with a reputation for restraint. Suddenly standing, arms crossed, notebook clutched to his chest. "This wasn't journalism," he said into the stunned air. "This was character assassination wrapped in strategy. I won't pretend we didn't know, but now we can't pretend we didn't hear." Gasps turned into murmurs. Murmurs became movement. One by one, other members of the press stood up, not in protest, but in something heavier. Shame. A few looked directly at Laura, their faces twisted not in hatred, but in something worse. Disappointment. As if the illusion of professionalism had just been shattered, and the pieces were cutting deeper than expected. Backstage, inside the sleek, glass-walled newsroom overlooking the studio, the Fox News production staff stared at the live feed in frozen disbelief. Half were whispering frantically into headsets. The other half weren't saying a word. The lead editor, a woman who had worked with Laura for 7 years, slowly removed her earpiece and let it fall against her collar. Her expression said everything. "We saw it. We let it happen. But now it's on tape." Another producer, young, ambitious, and previously loyal, muttered just loud enough for others to hear. "She played the whole thing like a rating stunt. Not a single second of that was about truth." He looked around the control room. "She didn't just go after Jasmine. She went after integrity and expected us to clap." Outside the newsroom, the clip was already circling among political correspondents from rival outlets. CNN, MSNBC. Even a few right-leaning independents began tweeting phrases like deeply inappropriate, disgraceful tactic, and manufactured narrative. One editor from Politico wrote in all caps, "This is a bomb," and another from The Hill quote tweeted the leaked video with a single line. "This isn't commentary. This is sabotage." What stunned them most wasn't just the content of the audio, but its cold calculation. "Let's pin her as the race lady. Ratings will skyrocket." It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a business plan spoken aloud, a blueprint for how to weaponize identity, bury empathy, and broadcast it all with a smile under studio lights. And it wasn't just outsiders calling it out. One of Fox's own national correspondents, off-air but very much online, tweeted within minutes, "I work here. I've been proud of some of what we've done, but this was an ambush. Crockett deserved honesty, not exploitation." Inside the studio, the ripple effect was almost physical. The air grew heavier. The boundaries between the show and the fallout blurred. A camera operator turned off his light early. The co-host looked like he'd swallowed glass. Even the interns, usually invisible shadows in black polos, stood in the back of the room, wide-eyed and silent, as if watching something historic collapse in front of them. Laura, still in her seat, felt it all closing in. Her shoulders were squared, her expression frozen in a tight approximation of control. But behind her eyes, the panic was unmistakable. She had built her brand on command, precision, and the illusion of moral certainty. But now her own voice had betrayed her. More damning than any critic, more undeniable than any rebuttal. She had said it. She had meant it. And now the world knew. And Jasmine? She hadn't moved, not one step, not one syllable. Her silence was no longer a pause. It was possession. She didn't need to respond. She didn't need to smirk or speak or point to the screen. Because the truth had done what it always does when left unfiltered. It took the room back. The injustice she had faced, being talked over, edited, baited, labeled, was now fully visible to everyone watching. She had survived not just the attack, but the setup. And now the trap lay exposed, with its builder still sitting inside it. In a media world where spin reigned supreme, something had broken through. Undeniable intent. And it wasn't Jasmine who had revealed it. It was Laura's own ambition. And now even her allies couldn't look away. The damage had been done, but the wound had not yet closed. The studio still crackled with the raw aftermath of exposure. Laura's mask lay in digital ruins, her voice weaponized against herself. Fox producers whispered behind glass like medics after a failed operation. No cue cards, no scripts. Just the hollow sound of a set that no longer obeyed its architect. And in the middle of it all, unshaken, unbent, stood Jasmine Crockett. She hadn't moved since the leak. She didn't need to. Her power no longer came from posture or tone, but from something deeper, undeniable moral gravity. The audience had long stopped seeing her as a politician. In their eyes now, she was something more elemental, the witness, the wound, and the reckoning. Laura tried, just once, to clear her throat, perhaps to regain composure, to claw back control, to say something clever. But the sound barely registered, drowned beneath the weight of what had already been said. There are moments where silence becomes a verdict, and Laura had just received hers. Jasmine slowly turned toward the camera. It was the only motion in the room. Even the lights seemed to still for her. Even the air itself held back. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her cadence. But she spoke like someone addressing not just a studio, but a nation. A memory. A buried truth clawing its way back into the light. "If fighting for equality makes me the race card queen," she said, each word a nail in the coffin of the false narrative built around her, "then every silent mother, every silenced child, and every buried body under injustice should be part of my royal court." The line didn't shout. It resonated. It wasn't a clapback. It was a eulogy. Not just for those lost in traffic stops and courtrooms, but for every time a voice like hers had been dismissed, mocked, or twisted into threat. For a second, just one, no one moved. Not even to breathe. It was as if the entire room had been turned into a still image. Then a beat later, it began. The applause hit like a shockwave. Not scattered this time, not cautious. It erupted, raw, thunderous, involuntary. Hands slapped together not for performance, but because the body had to do something. People stood without realizing they'd risen. Some shouted, some sobbed. Others just clapped and clapped and clapped, as if the sound could carry Jasmine's words beyond the ceiling, beyond the network, beyond the camera, and into the places justice hadn't yet reached. One woman in the front row dropped her phone as she stood. A man near the back, who hadn't applauded once the entire night, now had tears streaming down his cheeks. A student in the third row clutched her chest, whispering, "Say it again, say it again," though the words had already scorched themselves into the air. And behind the glass wall of the control booth, the lead showrunner, the woman who had overseen hundreds of broadcasts, scripted thousands of transitions, and wrangled chaos daily, sank into her chair and began to cry. Not loud, not performative, just quietly, shoulders trembling, hands to her mouth. She had come into this segment expecting ratings. What she got instead was revelation. She looked at the monitor and saw Jasmine standing there. Not flinching, not preening, just holding the room like it was her birthright. And for a moment, for the first time in her producing career, she didn't think about what came next. She didn't cue a break. She didn't signal a pan. She just watched, because something rare had happened in front of her cameras. Something real. Back on set, Laura remained seated, but it no longer looked like a seat of power. It looked like a chair in a hearing, a witness box. Her expression, once smooth, strategic, was now unreadable. Not because she had mastered restraint, but because she had lost her script. She looked to her left, then to the teleprompter. Blank. To her earpiece. Dead. To the crew, avoiding eye contact. And still the applause raged. It wasn't for Jasmine's politics. It wasn't even for her defiance. It was for her truth, spoken plainly in a room designed to mute it. Cameras panned slightly to follow the crowd's movement, but no one directed them. They moved by instinct now. The room no longer belonged to producers or sponsors or algorithms. It belonged to the moment, and the moment belonged to her. Jasmine Crockett didn't bow. She didn't wave. She simply stood, one hand resting gently on the DOJ folder still sitting on the desk. Her voice had ended minutes ago, but her presence hadn't. She had stepped into enemy territory and made it sacred. She had walked into a trap and turned it into testimony. And now, the whole country was watching her stand on the ashes of the narrative they tried to bury her with. No one said her name. They didn't have to, because in the final seconds of that broadcast, as cameras prepared to fade and lights began to dim, one truth had cemented itself louder than anything Laura Ingraham had spoken all night. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just endured. She had ruled. The cameras faded to black, but the moment refused to die. Even after the lights dimmed and the audience dispersed in stunned silence, something in the air refused to settle. What Jasmine had spoken, what she had claimed, wasn't just a defense. It was a declaration. And declarations, when delivered in the right voice, have a way of echoing far beyond the room in which they are spoken. By morning, she was everywhere. Clips from the final 2 minutes of the broadcast exploded across social media, not with outrage, but with awe. Her final words, delivered with ice and fire in equal measure, now looped endlessly with the kind of reverence usually reserved for prophets or revolutionaries. If fighting for equality makes me the race card queen, people didn't just quote it. They branded it, wore it, graffitied it on the walls of cities still aching from buried names. In Chicago, a muralist painted Jasmine's likeness 6 stories high, her eyes staring straight out onto the west side, the words "Long live the crown" etched in gold across the bricks beside her. In Brooklyn, a vendor on Fulton Street sold black hoodies stamped with her silhouette and the title that was meant to bury her: Race Card Queen. The font was jagged, almost violent, but under it sat a single line of quiet rebellion. Silence is what keeps injustice alive. At UC Berkeley, a packed auditorium fell silent as Jasmine entered, not because of fame, but because of gravity. She walked onto the stage not like a politician, but like someone who had just survived a battle and emerged without a single word to apologize for. Students rose instinctively. Professors wept. And when she spoke, she didn't recount the interview. She dissected it. She turned the night's anatomy into curriculum. "What you saw on that stage," she said, "wasn't an argument, it was extraction. Extraction of dignity, extraction of narrative. And I answered not just for myself, but for every mother still waiting for the apology this system has no language for." At Howard University, her name became a chant before her feet even touched the podium. 1,000 black students stood with fists raised as Jasmine stepped forward, the stage vibrating beneath their feet. Behind her, a banner stretched the width of the auditorium. Not a card, not a queen, a witness. And still, she refused to celebrate. Because the truth that made her famous wasn't new. It had always been there, buried under press releases, redacted in court filings, drowned out by commentators who spoke louder than they listened. The only difference now was that the world had been forced to look. And they didn't just see Jasmine. They saw themselves, their mothers, their neighbors, their mugshots, their missed chances, their unburied rage. Everywhere she went, people brought her stories. A woman handed her a folded letter with a photo of her brother who had been wrongfully incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit. 12 years served, 2 words uttered in return: clerical error. A college athlete pressed a copy of his student conduct file into her hands, marked with accusations he had never been allowed to contest. A veteran in Detroit, standing in a food bank line, whispered to her, "They called me a hero in Baghdad and a thug in Baltimore." She listened. She always listened, because the crown they placed on her head was forged from the weight of the unheard. She didn't ask for it, but she refused to let it collect dust on a pedestal. And the media? They scrambled to catch up. Outlets that once labeled her combative now struggled for words that didn't taste like hypocrisy. One major news network aired a special titled "The Reckoning of Language," examining how coded terms like race card had been used to delegitimize voices for decades. Journalists who once ignored her inbox now sent desperate requests for interviews, asking if she would clarify her position or share her insights on race in media. She declined most of them. "I've said what I came to say," she told one editorial board, her voice even. "You just weren't listening before the cameras turned on." And yet, despite the surge of attention, she never lost the scar tissue that built her. She remembered the first time she was called too loud in a courtroom for asking why her client's file was missing. She remembered the breath she had to hold after being told her tone was too emotional during a sentencing appeal for a teenager the system had already given up on. She remembered the years she spent crafting arguments with the precision of a surgeon, only to watch them be dismissed as rants the moment she stepped out of line. That was the weight behind her voice on that stage. That was the pain they hadn't clipped into sound bites. And now the title they'd used to try to reduce her, Race Card Queen, had become something else entirely. It became a symbol not of division, but defiance. Not of grievance, but grief, refined, rechanneled, renamed. It became the title etched onto signs at protests in Philadelphia, woven into spoken word poems in South LA, and whispered between daughters and mothers who had both been stopped, searched, and silenced. It was stitched into fabric, carved into murals, spray-painted beneath bridges, printed on pins, tattooed on skin. Not for her ego, but for their memory. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive the ambush. She claimed the crown they forged for her in malice, and she turned it into a monument they could never tear down. But while Jasmine rose into the light, Laura Ingraham quietly disappeared into the dark. It didn't happen with headlines or press conferences. It happened the way all media empires crack, silently, then all at once. The Monday after the broadcast, her chair on The Nation Speak sat empty. A substitute host read a cold two-sentence memo from the network. "Laura Ingraham will be taking a temporary leave to address matters unrelated to programming. We appreciate your understanding." No further explanation. No farewell. Just a ghost in the studio lights where once there was spectacle. Behind closed doors, the truth was less polite. Advertisers began pulling out within hours of the leaked clip. Civil rights organizations launched petitions. A group of former producers, some from her own team, submitted an open letter to the network's legal counsel alleging chronic editorial manipulation, racial provocation for ratings, and pattern-based disinformation. And in internal meetings, Fox News executives didn't ask if Laura should step away. They debated how long she could disappear before public memory cooled. They underestimated how far the fire had already spread. The clip, just 13 seconds long, had become the most replayed media leak of the year. It was analyzed on podcasts, played in classrooms, cited in op-eds, dissected in documentaries. It wasn't just that Laura had weaponized race for entertainment. It was that she had bragged about it. On tape, smirking, strategic, unapologetic. For years, she had danced the edge of outrage and plausible deniability. This time, she fell in. And as she vanished from airwaves, replaced by forgettable substitutes and reruns, something strange happened to the very words she once used as a weapon. Race Card Queen. The phrase, born as mockery, had survived its assassin. It no longer evokes sarcasm. It invokes strength. And not the soft, sanitized kind that dies in slogans. The hard kind. The kind etched into scars. The kind that rises from humiliation and dares to speak louder. Street vendors across cities began selling minimalist shirts. Just black cotton, white print, RCQ. No explanation. No branding. Just 3 letters that now carried the weight of defiance. Graffiti artists began tagging alleyways and courthouse steps with gold crowns spray-painted beside silhouettes of Jasmine's final stare into the camera. One printmaking collective in Atlanta even launched a series of protest art titled Card Carriers, featuring the faces of activists, victims, and mothers who had buried sons, each wearing a subtle, shining crown. University students began forming panels around the phrase. What began as a televised insult was now a framework, a cultural lens through which to examine the historical silencing of Black resistance. Professors cited it alongside Kimberly Crenshaw. Artists incorporated it into spoken word. High school girls wore it like armor in classrooms where they were told they were too loud for daring to correct a teacher on American history. And still, Laura remained off screen. The woman who once dictated national conversation, who choreographed talking points like combat, now existed only in silence. Her name, when spoken, arrived with a question mark, not a period. Where had she gone? Would she return? Did she regret it? But regret isn't measured by retraction. It's measured by what refuses to die. And Race Card Queen refused, because what Laura intended as a death sentence had become a resurrection. She tried to brand Jasmine with shame and instead etched her into legend. She tried to fracture her audience with sarcasm and instead gave them a banner. She tried to manufacture spectacle and instead exposed herself as its engineer. And Jasmine, she never once spoke Laura's name again, because the insult no longer needed dismantling. It had already been reborn. What once dripped with venom now gleamed with resilience. What once threatened to bury now refused to bow. And in the echo of the studio that night, in the silence that swallowed Laura's final words, the world learned something it couldn't unlearn. Truth once spoken in fire cannot be boiled down to a soundbite, and a crown once claimed in the name of justice can never be taken back. And as the noise faded, as the headlines dimmed and the cameras turned elsewhere, what remained was not scandal, but revelation. What stayed behind wasn't the sound of applause or the fall of a pundit. It was the stillness that comes when a society has been forced to confront its own reflection and dares not look away. The human lesson in Jasmine Crockett's story was never just about winning a debate or reclaiming an insult. It was about survival, with soul intact. It was about the cost of speaking truth in rooms built to mute it, about the courage it takes to stay calm when they call you chaos, to stay kind when they paint you as threat. It was about a world so addicted to performance that it forgot the price of erasure. And Jasmine? She stood in the crosshairs and proved that dignity, when anchored in justice, is not fragile. It is immovable. She taught the country that words designed to humiliate can be reforged into shields. That identity isn't a weakness to escape, but a truth to defend. That when power tries to shrink you, you answer not with apology, but with clarity. And that silence, so often sold as civility, is not neutral. It is complicit. What she faced wasn't just personal, it was historical. A lineage of women who were too loud, too black, too brave. And she didn't run from that legacy. She stepped into it. Because the lesson was never about her alone. It was about every person watching who had once been talked over, passed up, called dramatic for daring to feel, or dangerous for daring to speak. It was about showing the world that the most powerful act of resistance isn't rage. It's truth spoken calmly into the fire. Not to be liked, not to be praised, but to be heard, to be counted. And if one woman, unarmed but unafraid, could take the insult meant to bury her and crown herself with it, then maybe, just maybe, the rest of us could stop flinching every time we're told we're too much. Maybe we could stop editing ourselves for comfort that was never ours to begin with. Maybe the greatest rebellion isn't the roar, it's the refusal to whisper. That was the real victory, not that she changed minds, but that she reminded them. Truth doesn't need permission to survive. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.